Hello everyone, this is Mike and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to go over some fundamental topics here dealing with the difference between the commandlets that work with formatting, selecting, and using for each. So I chose this topic because in the most recent classes that I've been teaching, I've noticed that, and I've also noticed this in the past, that students have had a lot of trouble understanding the differences between these things. So figured it would be a good topic for a video and maybe a good review for anybody who maybe is a little more experienced in PowerShell as well to kind of know, what's kind of happening between them. Okay, so let me switch over to the lab environment here, and let's go ahead and get started. So up on the screen here, I have basically a just simple PowerShell console. I'm running this on a 2022 domain controller. So that's kind of where I'm setting at here. So to start with here, let's say we're running a commandlet. So let's say I'll do something, simple like get service, maybe looking at, I don't know, a couple services that are there. So the first thing to understand when we're looking at PowerShell is what it does for output. So when you run a commandlet and that commandlet produces some type of output, that output is in the form of a .NET object. Right? So that .NET object or objects plural in this case, because it is producing more than one, are placed into an area in PowerShell called the pipeline. And basically, this pipeline is for holding these .NET objects temporarily as you are running some code on your line here. Okay? So in this case, I have a single commandlet with a parameter on it. Now, the purpose of it, this pipeline here, is to kind of hold these .NET objects in the situation where maybe you want to take the output of one commandlet and pipe that to be, let's see, pipe that to be the input or the data that another commandlet's going to use. So in this case here, before I hit enter, this is producing a .NET object, and that .NET object is going to be used by this commandlet here, okay, like so. So if I kind of look at get service now, we could see that it is indeed running the bit service. Right? So that's kind of one use of these .NET objects that are held in PowerShell's pipeline, to be able to take them and move them from the output of one commandlet to now be the input for another commandlet. Right? And I've got a video up, I think I did this one way back in the beginning of my channel, called, which works with pipeline parameter binding. So this is basically the system that PowerShell uses to determine if there is a .NET object in the pipeline produced by one commandlet, what parameter does that object get sent to on the next commandlet here? So that is using a system called pipeline parameter binding. Now, what if, though, you don't have a commandlet to send the data to? So this produces an object, a .NET object. It's passed over to this commandlet. Well, what if you don't have that, like this scenario up here? So if I run this, you'll notice that we see screen output instead. Now what's happening with that is this commandlet produced the .NET object, or objects in this case, put them in PowerShell's pipeline, but there's nothing else left to do. This command line, if you will, is basically finished. Okay, so what PowerShell does is it sees that there's these .NET objects in the pipeline and there's nothing else to run, there's no other code to run, so it outputs them to the screen. And so that's what caused this screen output to appear. It's the fact that there were some .NET objects left over in the pipeline after all of this code ran. All of this. I mean, it's only one commandlet, but still, all of this code ran. Okay? So a lot of what we do in PowerShell is around manipulating those .NET objects in PowerShell's pipeline. And that's where formatting, selecting, and for each come into play. Okay, so let's talk about like the first one here. Actually, before we even talk about that, let's talk about what just happened here. Let's say by by just PowerShell doing its default behavior. So when there's objects left in the pipeline and they have to be outputted to the screen, PowerShell will follow some rules for how it does that. Right? So basically, the rules are kind of determined based on what type of object is in the pipeline. So if I look here, if I take this commandlet that would produce that output, and I pipe it over to a commandlet called getMember, that would show me what was being placed into the pipeline. So literally like what type of object was placed into the pipeline. Okay, and this is the full, namespace information and class information for this object, straight out of .NET Framework. So you could actually take this, pop it into a search engine, and Google it or whatever, and you would get the Microsoft documentation for this type of object that would show the 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 properties and methods, basically the membership, if you will, that's available on this object. So methods represent actions I can take against the object. Properties represent facts about the object. And so these are kind of like straight out of the .NET framework, right? Events are a programming thing. So if you want some type of programming hook, you could use that. And then these other ones here, aliases, alias properties, and script methods, these are things that are added onto that object while it's existing in PowerShell. So they don't per se exist in the .NET framework documentation. They're just kind of added on, if you will, right? So that gives us an idea of what object we're working with. Now, what's actually kind of a little confusing to start with, though, is when you're first doing your output, you don't see all of that information, right? So these are the properties that I see, but these are all that are actually there, okay? So that's kind of a big difference. Now, what PowerShell does by default here is it uses something called default formatting, where if there's a certain type of object in the pipeline and that object has to be written to the screen, PowerShell in a lot of cases has like almost like a recipe it needs to follow in order to output that to the screen. Now, a lot of the default commandlets that come with Windows, if you look in PowerShell's installation directory, let's go to Windows, System32, Windows PowerShell, let's go find that, V1, and notice this .NET types .format.ps1xml. So that is a view definition file in PowerShell. And if I open it with just like Notepad, and I look here, you can see the different views that have been defined for the different types of objects. Okay, so like for instance here, I was looking for a service controller. That's what the commandlets I've been running have produced, the get service commandlet. So if I look here, I can go find, like for instance, the view, right, for this type of object, where if it needs to be outputted to the screen, you can see it wants to make a table with column headers that are 8 characters, 18 characters, and 38 characters wide. And then within those columns, we're going to write the status property, the name property, and the display name. So that is the recipe for this output right here. Okay, so it made a table. It made 8, 18, and 38 as the widths for those columns. And then it had status, name, and display name as the properties from the object that was in the pipeline. Okay, so we could see there's name right there. There was status right there, and display name is right there. Okay, so that's what PowerShell does by default. Right? Now, a lot of commandlets, uh, per whatever .NET objects they produced, they can also have other views defined for them. So if it's not just commandlets that come with Windows, if you're talking Active Directory or SQL or Exchange or Azure, something like that, views can also be defined in those individual modules themselves. Okay, so just think of a view as kind of like a recipe for when an object has to be produced or displayed to the screen, what is it going to do? Right, so if we have an object, how is it going to display? So in this case, these three properties were chosen as a table. Right? Now, what if I want to change that up? Okay, so the first thing we could do to kind of change how maybe the data looks on the screen is to use formatting commands. And the probably the two most popular ones would be format table and format list. So if I run format table with this commandlet here, you might notice it doesn't look any different, right? Because it was already doing a table to start with. However, with format table, there's parameters I can use like property, where if I want to make up my own table with my own properties, something like that, and just be aware whatever property you write, it has to be in the original .NET object. Okay, so you can't just make stuff up. So we could make our own, right? Now, the thing to remember though with the formatting commands is they modify the screen output. So they're pretty much useless if the commandlet that you're piping the data to does not produce any output to begin with. Okay, so it has to be making screen output, right? So this gets our table. Now you could keep this so it's just displaying to the screen, or you could use a commandlet called outFile if you want the information as it would displayed on the screen written out to a text file. So let's do outFile. We'll give a file path, c:\demo, and we'll call it out1.text because that's basically what it does. So if I go and look at this, let's go back to my C drive, go to demo, and out one, you can see what's actually there, right? So outFile is just basically a commandlet that's taking what would have shown up on the screen exactly the way it would have shown up on the screen and just writing it out to a text file, right? That's all it's doing. Now, if you use, though, the formatting commands and then make some other type of output. Like if I do export CSV, let's again give it a path, c:\demo, let's call this out2.csv. One of the things you'll find is the output for it is going to look like a bunch of gibberish. Okay, so if I just open this, let's maybe open it with Notepad here. You'll notice it looks like a pile of garbage, if you will. And what's actually happening here is when you use the format commands, let me kind of pull this, take the export out of here, and show what's actually happening in the pipeline by piping whatever this is producing for output over to get member. And you'll notice that within the get member, the service controller that we were working with originally, that this commandlet produced for the .NET object, you'll notice it's nowhere to be found here. Instead, we have a bunch of formatting objects that have been put into the pipeline, which isn't bad in and of itself, but these formatting objects are only there for doing your screen output, right? Like so. If these are then, written to something else like export CSV, convert to HTML, export CLI XML, they're not going to produce this data in whatever that next output file would be. Okay, so when we're looking at the formatting commands, it's basically like you want to use them when you're just going to want to look at the data on the screen, or you're going to want to do an out file. Okay, that's basically about it. Now, another good use, though, of maybe the formatting commands would be instead of format table, we'll do format list, right? And that, when you run it, it takes what objects are in the pipeline and displays them in list format with their properties on the left and their values on the right. Okay, and you could see here's the first object, there's a space, and then here's the second object. Right, so with this, you could see a little more detail about what's happening with your objects. Right? And format list, if you also specify, you can specify what properties you want if you wanted to do that. Okay, so I can look for name, status, and start type, and it displays it out as a list. Now, another popular thing to do with format list is what if you want to see all of the properties? You could just do a wildcard there. And then, notice you're seeing everything, right? So if I want to see everything, as in every property and its value, even if it's empty, we could use this using format list. Okay, now, uh, in case you're not familiar, I'm typing kind of all of these commandlets out with the full commandlet name. Okay, so there's also aliases that we could use. So for instance, format list can actually be alias down to just FL. Right? And format table likewise would be FT. And that can work. Okay, so you can see that that ran right there. And then lastly, the property parameter is what we call positional. So the property parameter is positional. That's a lot of P's there. And so basically you can just provide the value without having the actual property name there. So if I get rid of this, that can now be all you have to type in to see all of the properties up on the screen, right? So we went from, format list, like this, with everything specified out, down to like that. All right. So that's kind of a look at formatting it and what it's for. Now, the next thing could be if I want to do selecting. Okay, so with this, with selecting, we're going to use a commandlet called select object. Now, let me kind of preface this ahead of time. What select object does, at least in the context that I'm talking about here, is it allows me to specify what what properties do I want to keep on the objects in the pipeline. So what select object does is it manipulates the object that's in the pipeline. Okay, so like for instance here, if I pipe this over to get member, which is an alias of GM, we saw this earlier, I can see what properties are there, right? So all of those properties are there. And if I were to write this data out to a file, let's maybe do the export CSV, and then give it a path, c:\demo, let's do out3.csv. We could see that it wrote all of that information out, right? So we have our CSV format. So there's our header row with all of the properties, and then here's the first object with the actual data for each of those properties, and the second object right there. And notice it did everything. It wrote out every property on each object into this file. So what if I don't want everything? Okay, that's where potentially select object could come into play beforehand. So again, we saw what was in the pipeline. So this was the service controller, right? This was the service controller with all of its properties. And so if I take this over to select object, I can specify using the property parameter what ones I want. Let's do status and maybe, oops, start type. Did I spell that right? Yeah. Okay, so I go ahead and I run that. Oops, helps if I do a comma instead of a period. There we go. And so we could see what's happening there. Now, if you're kind of, paying close attention here, you might realize like, well, wait a minute, Mike. This output looked the exact same as when you did format table. And if you look at it on the screen, you're not wrong. Okay, but here's the difference. If I pipe this over to get member, notice the original object is still there. It's moved into a different namespace. It's now in the selected namespace, but it's still the original object, if you will. And notice like all of the methods that were specific for the service controller have been stripped off. You've got a couple just generic methods that go with every .NET object. And then all of the properties are now missing, except the ones that I told it to hold on to. Right? So it's still keeping the original object that was in the pipeline. So this produced the service controller, and this is basically modifying that service controller object, just leaving these three properties. So now what's kind of cool about this is now I could export this in CSV format and just literally keep exactly those properties. So again, there's my object, there's my header row, and then there's the two objects with the three properties I wanted. Okay, so that allows me to kind of fine tune that particular output, right? So kind of work with that object. Right? So that's kind of using select object. Now you can also abbreviate. There is some aliases here. So for instance, select object has an alias of just select. Right? So if I run that, you can see it produces that. And then lastly, um, we could get rid of property, right? Because that is a positional parameter as well. So these data values are fed invisibly to the property parameter behind the scenes. That's what a positional parameter is, right? So that would work as well, right? And in fact, if you wanted to use, let's say you wanted to grab all of the uh, all of the properties and you want to see it on the screen, you could actually use select object to do that as well. Because I had mentioned earlier, right, you could do format list, property star, and that would allow you to see all of the information. Well, you could also do select object and do property star as well. And that would mimic the behavior of format list, okay, where you could see all of the properties. And, again, you could alias this out as well. Use positional parameters there, and then just do select, and you kind of get the same result. So you could do select star as one way of seeing all of the properties for the objects up on the screen. And you could also do format list star, right? So either one kind of works, right? Now, in some situations, though, selecting may not be what we need to do, right? Um, so what I mean by that is when you look at, let's say, some form of output in the pipeline, everything in PowerShell kind of is in the form of .NET objects, okay? Whether we like it or not. And let's say, for instance, I go back to the original commandlet here, get service, pipe that over to get member. Notice that for all of these properties, like you see status, display name, machine name, start type. Okay, they are, again, properties for this object here, the service controller object, but their data, like literally the info that's inside each of those properties, that is an object in its own right. Okay, so inside of an object, you have properties, and the data in those properties are objects themselves. So if you look at, like, let's say service name, that is a string object. Okay, if you're not familiar, string is basically a bunch of ASCII text. So it's one of the more popular objects you see, at least with PowerShell. Notice like can stop, that's a Boolean object. That means it exists in only a true or false state. Status is a system.serviceProcess.service controller status object. Okay, so that's literally the data that's in there. It's that type of object. Now, there are going to be situations within PowerShell where you want to grab the object that's in the property value of the original object that's in the pipeline. Okay? So that's where the last thing that we could do is for each. Okay, so we're going to use a commandlet called foreach-object. Now, again, some people don't necessarily get the purpose of it, but it's you're trying to fine tune what you want to supply to whatever whatever code you happen to be running, right? So like let's say for instance, I was doing something here like with get service. Let's say I did name and then I happen to use computer name and I'm putting the name of a computer in. Okay, so that runs, right? I'm not going to point it to another computer because I don't have any more on in my lab environment here. So it's just this one or nothing. But notice I'm supplying a value to computer name. And if I go look at the help on get service, you can see for computer name that is expecting a string object. Okay, so if you feed it anything else, it is not going to like that. So this parameter accepts string objects and that's it. Okay, so where could this run you into trouble? Well, let's say, for instance, I want to grab a bunch of computer names, let's say. Okay, and so let's say maybe I'm doing a query out of Active Directory. So get 80 computer, I don't know, filter star. You'll notice that this produces a bunch of computer objects, right? It produces, grabs information out of Active Directory. And if I go and pipe this to get member, you could see it's producing this type of object, right? So it's producing an 80 computer object, okay, which again has properties on it. And notice you have a name, so the actual names of the computers, that is existing in string format, okay, system.string, right? So let's say I wanted to do something like this. So I want to grab the computers. I want to grab those two services, but I want to grab them from a bunch of computers. So maybe you're like, hey, I know how to do parenthetical expressions, something like that, right? And the problem that's going to happen when you do this is it's going to error out because this code here is producing an AD computer object and it's being fed to this parameter which accepts string objects. So what I need to happen here is I need this code in here to output string objects because this parameter only accepts string objects. Okay, so how do we go about doing that? Well, what we could do is we can let's fine tune the code here before we put it into the parenthetical. So let's say again here, just running it on its own, it's producing the 80 computer. So you might be thinking, well, we already know how to do that, right? We could do select, right? And that's kind of not the hill you want to be going, up here. So if I do select object and I say property name, I do get the names of the computers in question, but if I pipe this to get member, you see I still have the 80 computer object in the pipeline. I just removed all the properties except one on it. Okay, so that's not what I need to do here. What I need to do is I need to take the 80 computer that's in the pipeline, grab the object that's in the name property, and put that object in the pipeline, replacing the 80 computer. So I want to, take the 80 computer object, get rid of it, and in its place, put the string object that's in the name property. Right? So I can do that by using a commandlet called foreach-object. Right? So foreach-object, we're going to use the member name parameter on it, and then I literally just type the name of the property that I want to grab the object out of. So in this case, that was name. Right? So I run that, and you could see the output here. Notice between selecting and doing for each, you'll notice the output's a little different. See how in selecting you have a column header, uh, kind of showing that name is a property of some other object that's in the pipeline, like the 80 computer object. And here, notice you just have the raw values. And in fact, if I were to check this by piping it to get member, you'll notice that what's in the pipeline now is string objects. Okay, so now this code right here is all set to be put into that parenthetical expression, okay, that I had. Okay, so this would run perfectly fine. So let me bring up that one that failed before, like right here. Okay, and we'll instead put the get 80 computer filter star pipe and then for each object member name name. Right, so that's grabbing those. So this is outputting string objects, which are what was in the name property for the 80 computer object, and presenting those strings over to computer name. So this is still probably not going to work because I don't have all of these computers turned on, but we'll just hit enter and give it a shot. All right. But notice it didn't error right away. All right. So that's basically proper syntaxing here. Okay. So now this could have a fair amount of abbreviation done to it, by the way. Okay, so for each object has an alias of just for each, or percent, by the way. The percent sign is actually an alias for this as well. And member name, the member name parameter is actually positional as well. So if you just want to just type in name, it'll relay that to the member name parameter. If you will. So I'm done waiting for this here. I'm gonna hit Control C just to kind of exit out of this. Or maybe not. Come on. That's not working here. All right, so let me need to wait for this to finish here. What it's trying to do is it's timing out on all of the three other computers I don't have turned on here. So my apologies on that. Let me pause the video for a second. I'll come back when this is finally finished timing out, trying to contact the computers that don't exist right now. So bear with me one sec. Okay, so sorry about that. I was able to get that canceled out. So bringing back up the command here, um, I mentioned you could do some abbreviation to it. So let me kind of show that here. So for instance, with member name, so what we could do is we could not use member name. And then for each object, as I mentioned, you could use the alias of just for each, or you could actually use an alias of percent. So either one works, which is kind of weird. Right? So again, let me show each of those. Let me show each piece without running get service through here. So let's put that in, and you could notice, you could see that that worked. And again, if I just use for each, okay, that can work as well. All right. Now you don't have to limit yourself just to name, by the way. This can go grab any property that's there. So if I kind of, bring this back over to get member, 80 computer, like notice there's DNS host name as another property. So I could grab the values out of that as well. So if I did for each DNS host name, okay, that'll grab the values that are in there. All right. So again, kind of the purpose of for each when you're using it against a property is it grabs the objects that are in that property and puts those into the pipeline, replacing whatever the original object is there. So basically what's happening is we've got the 80 computer, okay, and by using for each, I'm grabbing the objects, like in this case, that are in DNS host names. So I'm grabbing those string objects and putting those in back into the pipeline, replacing the 80 computer object that was there. All right. So now another thing we can use for each for is calling methods. All right. So you could, if I happen to look at, like, let's say I do get service, and maybe we'll look at one service. So notice it stopped, and if I pipe it to get member, um, we could see the bit service is currently stopped, and on the service controller that's produced by this, you will see that there is a start method. All right, so the last thing we can use for each for, so if I do for each object, member name start, the fact that I'm using the name of a method, right, will call that method. So that's another fancy word you might hear used is you're enumerating a method. So that'll call that method. And now if I go back and look at the service, you can see it's running there. So that could be the other use of for each object is calling a method. Right? And you could also separately supply, if you need an argument list, you could supply an argument list if you needed it as well. So start does not need an argument list, so that's why I could just use member name and away we go. Okay, so that would be your second use of for each object. So for each object can extract the objects out of a property, putting those in the pipeline, and then for each object can also call methods on the object that's in the pipeline. Okay, so that was a kind of a review here and a quick look at using formatting, using selecting, and using for each object. Any questions, please hit me down in the comments. And if you did enjoy the content, please consider liking and subscribing. Helps the algorithm and makes my videos show up in more YouTube search results. So would appreciate it. And with that, have a good one, everyone, and we will see you in the next video.